I thought I had everything figured out until the day I found my children's belongings stuffed into garbage bags in our basement like discarded memories. But let me start from the beginning, because revenge is always sweeter when you understand exactly how deep the betrayal runs. Hi everyone, I'm Sarah, and if you're watching this from your kitchen table at 2 a.m. because you can't sleep, or maybe you're on your lunch break trying to escape your own reality for a few minutes, I want you to know that whatever brought you here tonight, you're exactly where you need to be. And please, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single one, and your stories give me strength on the days when mine feels too heavy to carry. Before I tell you about the moment that changed everything, I need you to understand something important. If you've ever felt like the person you trusted most in this world looked you in the eye and chose someone else over you and your children, then what I'm about to share might trigger something deep inside you. And if it does, if my story resonates with the pain you've been carrying, please hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Because the women who find their way to stories like mine, we need to stick together. We need to remind each other that we're not crazy, we're not asking for too much, and we damn sure deserve better than what we settled for. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and for 15 years, I believed I was living the American dream in our colonial house on Maple Street in Columbus, Ohio. White picket fence, 2 kids, a husband who worked in finance and promised me the world when we were 23 and stupid in love. Marcus was the kind of man who opened doors, remembered anniversaries, and called me beautiful even when I was 8 months pregnant and felt like a whale. My daughter Emma was 14, sharp as a whip and already talking about wanting to be a lawyer like her mom. My son Jake was 11, all elbows and energy, obsessed with baseball and still young enough to think his mom hung the moon. I was a family law attorney, specializing in divorce cases, which now feels like the universe's cruel joke. Every day, I watched marriages crumble in my office, listened to women sob about affairs and financial abuse and custody battles, and I'd drive home thinking how lucky I was that Marcus and I had built something different. Something real. Something that would last. The irony wasn't lost on me even then. I spent my days helping women escape toxic relationships, but I was so blind to what was happening in my own home that I might as well have been wearing a blindfold. Marcus had started traveling more for work about 2 years earlier. Regional manager for a pharmaceutical company, he said, lots of conferences and client meetings. I was proud of him. Proud of us. We were finally hitting our stride financially, the kids were in good schools, we'd paid off the minivan, and we were even talking about taking a family trip to Europe the next summer. The signs were all there, scattered like breadcrumbs leading to a house made of lies, but I was too busy juggling my own caseload and making sure Emma got to debate team practice and Jake didn't forget his baseball glove to notice that my husband was already building a new life without us. It started small. Marcus would come home from his trips quieter than usual, more distracted. He'd shower immediately, even if he'd only been gone for 2 days. His phone, which used to sit casually on the kitchen counter, suddenly became an extension of his hand. He'd take calls in the garage or step outside to answer texts that made him smile in ways I hadn't seen in months. When I asked about it, he had reasonable explanations for everything. Work stress. New clients. Market pressures. I believed him because why wouldn't I? This was Marcus, the man who cried when Emma took her first steps, who coached Jake's little league team every Saturday, who brought me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings and kissed my forehead like I was precious. The first real crack in my perfect life came on a Tuesday in March. I was in my office reviewing a prenup when my assistant Rebecca knocked on my door with a strange expression on her face. She was holding an envelope with my name on it, no return address, and she said a woman had dropped it off and specifically asked that it be given to me personally. Inside was a single photograph. Marcus and a woman I didn't recognize, having dinner at Romano's, the expensive Italian place downtown that we'd only been to twice in our entire marriage. They weren't just having dinner, they were leaning into each other like lovers, his hand covering hers on the table, her laughing at something he'd said with the kind of uninhibited joy that I realized, with a sinking stomach, I hadn't seen him direct at me in years. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the photo. The woman was beautiful in that effortless way that made you immediately feel inadequate. Blonde hair that caught the restaurant lighting like spun gold, designer clothes that probably cost more than my mortgage payment, and she was young. Not inappropriately young, but young enough that she probably didn't have stretch marks or worry about her teenager's grades or wonder if she should start using anti-aging cream. I sat in my office staring at that photo for 2 hours, my mind racing through every possible explanation that didn't involve my husband having an affair. Maybe it was a work dinner. Maybe she was a client. Maybe it was an old friend from college. Maybe. But deep down, in that place where women's intuition lives like a caged animal pacing back and forth, I knew exactly what I was looking at. That night, I waited until the kids were in bed and confronted Marcus in our kitchen. I placed the photo on the granite countertop between us like evidence in a trial, which I suppose it was. His face went through a series of expressions: surprise, guilt, calculation, and then something that looked almost like relief. "Sarah," he said, and I could hear the rehearsed explanation forming in his throat. "This isn't what it looks like." But I wasn't some naive client sitting in my office for the first time, discovering her world was built on lies. I was a divorce attorney who had heard every excuse, every justification, every weak attempt at explanation that cheating spouses offered when they got caught. So instead of letting him spin his web of half-truths, I looked him straight in the eye and asked the one question that mattered. "How long?" The silence stretched between us like a chasm opening up in our kitchen floor. Marcus ran his hand through his hair, a tell he'd had since college when he was nervous, and for a moment, I saw the boy I'd fallen in love with 20 years earlier. Young and scared and in over his head. But then he straightened his shoulders and became the man who was about to break my heart. 8 months, he said quietly. Her name is Vivian. 8 months. While I was helping Emma study for her SATs and driving Jake to baseball practice and building the life we'd promised each other, Marcus had been building another life entirely. 8 months of lies, 8 months of looking me in the eye over dinner and asking about my day while he was thinking about someone else, 8 months of kisses that tasted like betrayal. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something. I wanted to collapse on our kitchen floor and sob until there was nothing left inside me. Instead, I picked up the photo, looked at it one more time, and said the only thing that came to mind. "She's very pretty." Marcus looked confused, like he'd been braced for hysteria and didn't know what to do with my calm. "Sarah, we need to talk about this. About what this means." "What this means," I repeated, my voice sounding strange and distant in my own ears, "is that you've been lying to me for 8 months. What this means is that every time you told me you loved me during those 8 months, you were thinking about her. What this means is that our children's father is a stranger." I left him standing in the kitchen and went upstairs to our bedroom, where I sat on the edge of the bed we'd shared for 15 years and tried to figure out how to tell Emma and Jake that their perfect family was about to implode. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I stared at the ceiling and listened to Marcus moving around downstairs, probably pacing and trying to figure out how to manage this situation like it was just another business problem that needed solving. The next morning, he was gone before I woke up, and there was a note on his pillow. "Gone to Chicago for work. Back Friday. We'll figure this out when I get home. I love you, Sarah." That hasn't changed. But everything had changed, and we both knew it. I just didn't realize yet how much worse it was going to get. The thing about discovering your husband's affair is that once you start looking, you see evidence everywhere. It's like when you learn a new word and then suddenly hear it in every conversation, except instead of expanding your vocabulary, you're cataloging the ways your life has been a lie. Marcus came home from Chicago that Friday with flowers, white roses, which had been my favorite in college but hadn't been for years, and a speech about how we could work through this. He'd ended things with Vivian, he said. It was a mistake, a midlife crisis, whatever cliché made it easier for him to sleep at night. He wanted to save our marriage, save our family, make things right. I listened to his words while Emma and Jake did homework in the next room, their voices carrying through the walls as they argued about whose turn it was to feed the dog. Normal sounds of a normal family, except nothing about us was normal anymore. I found myself studying Marcus's face as he talked, looking for the tells I'd learned to recognize in 15 years of marriage, and realizing that I couldn't tell the difference between his truth and his lies anymore. Maybe I never could. "I need time," I told him, and he nodded like he expected that. Like he'd already calculated how much time he'd need to give me to make me feel like I had a choice in what happened next. But I wasn't just buying time to process my emotions. I was buying time to investigate, because my lawyer brain couldn't let go of the details that didn't add up. If this affair had only been going on for 8 months, why did Marcus seem so comfortable with the routine of deception? Why did his phone habits change a full year ago? And why, when I really thought about it, had he started working out and buying new clothes long before he supposedly met Vivian? I hired a private investigator named Dave Morrison, a gruff ex-cop who worked out of a cramped office above a sandwich shop and specialized in matrimonial cases. Dave had the kind of face that had seen too much and the kind of eyes that missed nothing. He charged me $2,000 upfront and promised me answers within 2 weeks. Most women don't really want the truth, he told me during our first meeting, his voice gravelly from too many cigarettes. They want confirmation of what they already suspect, or they want proof that their suspicions are wrong. But sometimes the truth is bigger and uglier than either of those things. Are you sure you want to know everything? I thought about Emma, who was already asking why I'd seemed so distracted lately, and Jake, who'd noticed that Marcus had missed his last 3 baseball games. I thought about the way Marcus looked at me now, not with guilt, exactly, but with something that felt like pity. Like I was a problem he needed to solve rather than a person he'd promised to love forever. I want to know everything, I told Dave. While I waited for his report, I threw myself into being the perfect wife and mother, which felt like playing a role in a play I hadn't auditioned for. I made Marcus's favorite dinner every night, asked about his work, smiled when he complimented my hair or made jokes that used to be funny. I helped Emma with her college applications and drove Jake to every practice and game, cheering from the bleachers with the same enthusiasm I'd always had, even though everything inside me felt hollow and strange. The hardest part was the nights. Marcus would reach for me in our bed, and I'd have to decide whether to let him touch me or pull away. Sometimes I let him, because rejecting him felt like admitting our marriage was over, and I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. Sometimes I couldn't bear it, the thought of his hands on my skin when those same hands had been touching someone else. On those nights, I'd make excuses, headache, early morning, stress from work, and we'd lie next to each other in the dark like strangers sharing a hotel room. Dave called me 13 days later and asked me to meet him at his office. His voice over the phone was different, more careful, and I knew before I walked up those stairs that whatever he'd found was worse than I'd imagined. "Sit down, Sarah," he said, and there was something almost gentle in his voice that scared me more than anger would have. He slid a manila folder across his desk, thick with documents and photographs that looked like evidence exhibits from a crime scene. The first photo was Marcus and Vivian, but not at Romano's. This was at a beach resort in Florida, both of them tan and relaxed, her hand resting on what was very obviously her pregnant belly. The timestamp on the photo was from 18 months ago. "She's his assistant," Dave said quietly. "Has been for 3 years. The pregnancy didn't carry to term, but they've been together since she started working for him. The Chicago trips, the conferences, most of them were lies. He's been setting up a separate life with her, Sarah. Apartment in her name, joint credit cards, the works." I flipped through more photos. Marcus and Vivian at grocery stores, at furniture stores, at what looked like parent-teacher conferences at a school I didn't recognize. In one photo, Vivian was holding the hand of a little girl who looked about 7 years old, and Marcus was crouched down talking to her like he'd known her forever. "She has a daughter," Dave continued, "from a previous relationship. Marcus has been playing stepdad for over a year now." The room felt like it was tilting. I gripped the edge of Dave's desk and tried to process what I was seeing. My husband hadn't just been having an affair, he'd been living a double life so complete that he'd effectively been married to 2 women, father to 5 children instead of 2, building a future that had no space for me or Emma or Jake. "There's more," Dave said, and I almost laughed because what more could there possibly be? The pharmaceutical company downsized 8 months ago. Marcus was let go, but has been getting unemployment and using credit to maintain both households. He's in debt, Sarah. Deep debt. The house, your house, has a second mortgage on it that was taken out 6 months ago. I looked up at Dave, and he nodded grimly. He's been using your home as collateral to finance his other life. If he defaults on those loans, you could lose everything. I sat in that cramped office above a sandwich shop and felt my entire world collapse into something unrecognizable. Marcus hadn't just betrayed me, he'd stolen from me. He'd put our children's security at risk to play house with someone else. He'd looked Emma and Jake in the eye every morning for over a year while systematically dismantling their future. What do I do? I asked Dave, and I heard my voice crack for the first time since this nightmare began. You get a good lawyer, he said. And you move fast, because men like your husband don't stop until they're forced to stop. This isn't going to get better on its own, and it's not going to get better because you're patient or understanding or willing to forgive. This gets better when you take control. I drove home that afternoon with a manila folder on my passenger seat like a bomb waiting to explode. Emma was at debate practice, Jake was at a friend's house, and Marcus was supposedly at work, except now I knew there was no work, just more lies stacked on top of the foundation of lies our marriage had become. I sat in our driveway for a long time, looking at the house we'd bought when Emma was a baby. The house where Jake had taken his first steps, where we'd hosted birthday parties and barbecues and Christmas mornings. The house that might not be ours much longer, depending on how deep Marcus had dug us into his pit of deception. When I finally walked through our front door, Marcus was in the kitchen making dinner, humming under his breath like he didn't have a care in the world. He looked up and smiled at me, that same smile that had made me fall in love with him 20 years ago, and asked how my day was. For just a moment, I considered pretending I didn't know anything. I could put Dave's folder in a drawer, continue playing the role of the trusting wife, and maybe find a way to live with the knowledge that my marriage was a performance. Maybe that would be easier for everyone. But then I thought about Emma, who was working so hard on her college applications and dreaming about her future, not knowing that her college fund might already be gone. I thought about Jake, who still believed his dad was a hero, not knowing that his hero had been lying to him every day for years. And I thought about myself, Sarah Mitchell, family law attorney who helped other women escape situations exactly like this one, who'd somehow been too close to see what was happening in her own life. We need to talk, I said, and Marcus's smile flickered just enough to let me know that he knew exactly what kind of conversation this was going to be. The confrontation that night was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, even in my years of handling contentious divorces. When you're representing someone else, you can maintain professional distance, offer tissues, and legal advice with clinical detachment. But when it's your own life exploding in real time, when it's your own children's future being gambled away, professional distance becomes impossible. Marcus tried to lie at first. Even when I spread Dave's photographs across our kitchen table like a poker hand he couldn't beat, he still tried to minimize, to explain, to make me feel like I was overreacting. The beach photos were from a work retreat, he said. The apartment was temporary housing for out-of-town employees. The credit cards were for business expenses that would be reimbursed. But I'm a lawyer, and I know the difference between truth and creative storytelling. I let him dig his hole deeper with each explanation, taking mental notes like I was deposing a hostile witness, until finally I pulled out the bank statements Dave had obtained showing the second mortgage on our house. Explain this, I said, sliding the papers across the table. Explain how you took out a $150,000 loan against our home without my knowledge or consent. That's when Marcus's mask finally slipped completely. The remorseful husband act disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating that I'd never seen before. He straightened in his chair, looked me dead in the eye, and said the words that would haunt me for months afterward. I did what I had to do to be happy, Sarah. Something you wouldn't understand. The casual cruelty of that statement hit me like a physical blow. Not just the admission that he'd been prioritizing his happiness over his family's security, but the implication that I was somehow incapable of understanding happiness. That my contentment with our life, my gratitude for what we'd built together, was somehow a character flaw rather than a choice. You've been lying to our children for over a year, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. You've put our home at risk. You've been playing father to someone else's child while treating your own kids like an inconvenience. And you think this is about happiness? Marcus laughed, and it was a sound I'd never heard from him before, bitter and mocking and completely devoid of warmth. You think this is about the kids? Sarah, You've been so busy building your perfect little life that you never once asked me if I wanted it. You decided we were happy, you decided our marriage was solid, you decided everything was fine because it worked for you. I decided. I stood up from the table, my hands shaking with rage. I decided to honor my wedding vows. I decided to put our family first. I decided to build something stable for Emma and Jake instead of chasing whatever made me feel good in the moment. You decided to stop being the woman I married, Marcus shot back, and there it was, the real truth underneath all the lies and justifications. When's the last time you surprised me, Sarah? When's the last time you got dressed up for me, or planned something spontaneous, or made me feel like I was more than just another item on your to-do list? The argument that followed was vicious and revealing in equal measure. Marcus accused me of being boring, predictable, more interested in being right than being happy. I accused him of being a coward who'd rather destroy his family than have an honest conversation about what wasn't working in our marriage. We said things that couldn't be unsaid, revealed resentments that had been festering for years, and by the time Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway asking why we were yelling, we'd already crossed every line that might have made reconciliation possible. Go back to bed, sweetheart, I told Emma, trying to soften my voice. Dad and I are just having a discussion. But Emma was 14 and smart, and she could see the photographs scattered across the table, could feel the toxic atmosphere crackling between her parents. Are you getting divorced? She asked, her voice small and scared. Marcus and I looked at each other across the wreckage of our kitchen table, and I realized that this was the moment our children would remember forever. Not the years of birthday parties and family vacations and goodnight kisses, but this moment when their parents' marriage died in front of them. We're working through some problems, Marcus said finally, which was possibly the first honest thing he'd said all night. After Emma went back to bed, Marcus and I finished our argument in harsh whispers. He admitted that he'd been planning to ask for a divorce anyway, that he'd been trying to figure out how to leave without losing everything. The affair, the loans, the secret life. It was all part of an exit strategy that involved him keeping as much as possible while leaving me to clean up the mess. Vivian understands me in ways you never did, he said, and I wanted to point out that understanding someone and enabling their worst impulses aren't the same thing, but I was too emotionally exhausted to continue fighting. That night, Marcus slept in the guest room, and I lay in our bed staring at the ceiling and trying to process the fact that my marriage was over. Not ending, over. It had been over for years, apparently, and I'd been too busy living my life to notice that my husband had already moved on. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal consultations, financial assessments, and difficult conversations with Emma and Jake. I told them the truth, because they deserved honesty even if their father hadn't been capable of providing it. I explained that Dad had been in a relationship with someone else, that he'd been lying to all of us, and that we were going to have to rebuild our lives without him. Jake, at 11, was mostly confused. He kept asking when Dad was coming home, when things would go back to normal, whether this was somehow his fault. Emma, older and more perceptive, was angry in the way that only teenagers can be, white-hot rage mixed with devastating insight. I hate him, she told me one night as I tucked her into bed. Not for leaving. For lying. For making us all pretend everything was okay when he was already gone. I wanted to tell her that hate was too strong, that Marcus was still her father despite everything, but I couldn't bring myself to defend him. He'd made his choices, and now we all had to live with the consequences. Marcus moved out 3 weeks after our confrontation, taking only his clothes and a few personal items. He didn't ask for anything else, didn't fight me on temporary custody arrangements, didn't even seem particularly interested in maintaining relationships with Emma and Jake. It was like he'd been waiting for permission to disappear completely, and our fight had given him exactly what he needed. The house felt different without him, not empty, exactly, but lighter somehow. Like we'd been holding our breath for months without realizing it, and could finally exhale. Emma started bringing friends over again. Jake began sleeping through the night without the anxiety-induced nightmares that had started around the time Marcus began traveling more. Even our dog seemed more relaxed, no longer cowering when footsteps approached the front door. But the financial situation was a nightmare that got worse every time I learned something new. Marcus hadn't just taken out a second mortgage, he'd been living on credit for months, using our joint accounts to finance his double life while contributing almost nothing to our actual household expenses. The pharmaceutical company confirmed that he'd been terminated 8 months earlier for poor performance and inappropriate conduct with a subordinate, which meant everything about his work stories had been fabricated. I was going to have to sell the house. Emma would probably have to take out student loans for college instead of using the savings account that no longer existed. Jake would have to give up travel baseball because we could no longer afford the fees and equipment. Our entire standard of living was about to change dramatically, not because of choices I'd made, but because of choices Marcus had made for all of us. The worst part wasn't the money, though. The worst part was the humiliation. I was a family law attorney who specialized in helping women navigate exactly this situation, and I'd been completely blindsided by my own husband's deception. My colleagues were professionally supportive but personally awkward, not sure how to handle the fact that one of their own had been so thoroughly fooled. But if you've ever been in a situation where someone you trusted completely turned out to be someone you didn't know at all, then you understand that the shock isn't really about missing red flags or being naive. It's about realizing that the person you loved never actually existed. The man I'd been married to for 15 years was a character Marcus had been playing, and he'd gotten so tired of the performance that he'd simply walked off the stage without warning the rest of the cast. I was about to learn, though, that Marcus wasn't done performing. He was just getting started on his most ambitious role yet. If I thought Marcus moving out was the end of our story, I was catastrophically wrong. What I didn't realize at the time was that everything up to that point had been preparation for something much worse. Marcus wasn't just leaving his family, he was orchestrating our complete destruction while positioning himself as the victim. The first sign that something bigger was happening came through Emma. She'd been spending court-ordered time with Marcus every other weekend, visits that usually involved expensive restaurants and guilt-driven shopping trips that we couldn't afford but that made him feel better about abandoning his responsibilities. Emma would come home with new clothes and stories about Vivian's kindness, about how sorry Marcus was for hurting us, about how he just wanted everyone to be happy. But during one of these visits, Emma overheard a phone conversation that changed everything. "Mom," she said when I picked her up from Marcus's apartment that Sunday evening, "I think Dad is planning something bad." She'd been in the bathroom when Marcus took a call, and through the thin walls, she'd heard him talking to someone about getting ahead of the narrative and making sure the kids understand what really happened. He'd mentioned lawyers and custody and something about me being unfit and unstable. My blood ran cold. I'd been so focused on the financial devastation Marcus had caused that I hadn't considered he might also be planning to challenge me for custody of Emma and Jake. But as I thought about it, the strategy made perfect sense from his perspective. If he could paint me as the problem, the bitter ex-wife who was turning the children against him, then he could justify his affair, his lies, and his financial crimes as the desperate actions of a man trying to escape an intolerable situation. I called my divorce attorney, Patricia Hendricks, first thing Monday morning. Patricia was a shark in designer suits who'd built her reputation destroying men who thought they could manipulate the system. She listened to my concerns with the kind of focused attention that reminded me why her retainer was so expensive. "He's building a case," she confirmed. "The question is what kind of case. If he's planning to fight for custody, he'll need to demonstrate that you're an unfit mother. If he's planning to minimize his financial obligations, he'll need to show that the marriage failed because of your behavior, not his." "But everyone knows about the affair," I protested. "The evidence is overwhelming." Patricia's smile was grim. "Sarah, you're a lawyer. You know that evidence only matters if the right story gets told. If Marcus can convince a judge that his affair was the result of years of emotional neglect or verbal abuse from you, then suddenly he becomes the victim instead of the perpetrator." She was right, and I hated her for being right. I'd seen it happen in my own practice. Men who cheated, lied, and stolen from their families somehow managing to win sympathy by claiming they'd been driven to desperate measures by impossible wives. The fact that I was an attorney myself might even work against me, since it would be easy to paint me as controlling and argumentative. "What do I do?" I asked. "Document everything," Patricia said. "Every interaction, every conversation, every promise he makes and breaks. And be prepared for him to escalate. Men like Marcus don't just want to win, they want to destroy the women who've seen through their masks." I started keeping a detailed journal of every interaction with Marcus, every conversation with Emma and Jake about their visits with him, every phone call and text message. I installed security cameras around our house and made sure I was never alone with Marcus during custody exchanges. I felt paranoid and exhausted, like I was living in a spy novel instead of trying to rebuild my life after divorce. But Patricia's warning proved prophetic. Within 2 weeks, Marcus had filed a motion requesting emergency custody of Emma and Jake, claiming that I was psychologically abusing them by discussing the details of our divorce and turning them against him. His filing included sworn statements from Vivian about my erratic behavior during phone calls, testimony from his mother about my vindictive attitude, and a psychological evaluation request that would delay any permanent custody arrangements for months. The most infuriating part was how calculated it all was. Marcus had spent weeks laying the groundwork for this narrative, carefully documenting every instance where I'd seemed emotional or upset, every time I'd asked questions about his finances or his relationship with Vivian. He twisted my legitimate concerns about his lying and manipulation into evidence of my instability. And then came the phone call that revealed the true scope of his plan. I was working late in my office when my assistant Rebecca knocked on my door with a worried expression. "Sarah, there's a woman here to see you. She says it's about your husband, but she won't give her name." The woman who walked into my office was probably in her 40s, well-dressed but nervous, with a kind of careful composure that comes from years of practice hiding strong emotions. She sat down across from my desk and studied my face for a long moment before speaking. "My name is Jennifer Walsh," she said finally. "And I think your husband is trying to do to you what he did to me." The story Jennifer told me was like looking into a funhouse mirror of my own life. She'd been married to Marcus for 6 years in his 20s, back when he was starting his career and she was working as a teacher. They'd been happy, or so she'd thought, until she discovered that Marcus had been having an affair with a co-worker and using their joint accounts to finance his double life. "The affair I could have forgiven," Jennifer said. "People make mistakes, relationships get complicated. But Marcus didn't just cheat on me, he systematically destroyed my reputation and my career to cover up what he'd done." When Jennifer had confronted Marcus about the affair, he'd immediately gone on the offensive. He'd filed for divorce claiming that she'd been verbally abusive and emotionally unstable. He'd convinced her friends and family that she'd become obsessed with controlling him, that she'd been checking his phone and following him around town. By the time the divorce was finalized, Jennifer had lost most of her social circle, her job at the local school district, and custody of their daughter. "He's very good at playing the victim," Jennifer continued. "Very good at making people feel sorry for him while painting his ex-wives as crazy, bitter women who can't let go. I lost everything because I believed that the truth would be enough to protect me." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew the answer. "Because he's doing it again," Jennifer said. "I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd remarried and that you were going through a divorce. When I heard he was fighting for custody and claiming you were unstable, I knew I had to warn you. Marcus doesn't just leave marriages, he burns them to the ground so thoroughly that his ex-wives can't rebuild." Jennifer pulled out a manila folder similar to the one Dave Morrison had given me weeks earlier, but this one was filled with legal documents, character assassination attempts, and evidence of a systematic campaign to destroy her credibility and her life. "This is what he's planning to do to you," she said, sliding the folder across my desk. "The custody challenge is just the beginning. He'll manufacture evidence of your instability, convince people that you're a threat to your own children, and position himself as their savior. By the time he's done, you won't just lose your marriage, you'll lose everything that matters to you." I spent the next 2 hours reading through Jennifer's documentation, and it was like reading a blueprint for my own destruction. The phone calls to my workplace claiming I was having a breakdown. The careful manipulation of mutual friends and family members. The gradual isolation that would leave me with no support system when the final blow came. Marcus had been planning this for months, maybe longer. Everything he'd done since our confrontation, the cooperative attitude about the separation, the lack of interest in fighting over property, even the expensive gifts for Emma and Jake during his weekend visits, had been calculated moves in a larger strategy. He wasn't trying to escape our marriage cleanly. He was trying to erase me completely, to rewrite our entire history so that I became the villain and he became the hero who'd rescued our children from an unstable mother. And the most terrifying part was that it might actually work. Marcus was charming, manipulative, and completely without conscience when it came to getting what he wanted. I was emotionally devastated, financially vulnerable, and about to be fighting for my life in a legal system that often favored men who knew how to play the victim. But Marcus had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated me, and he'd definitely underestimated my capacity for strategic thinking when my children's welfare was at stake. If he wanted to play games with our family's future, I was going to make sure I won. The war was just beginning, and I intended to be the last one standing. 3 months after Jennifer Walsh walked into my office and showed me Marcus's playbook, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to beat Marcus at his own game, but I was going to do it better than he ever could. Because unlike him, I actually cared about my children's well-being, and I wasn't willing to destroy innocent people to get what I wanted. The custody battle had been brutal so far. Marcus's lawyer was painting me as an unhinged ex-wife who was using Emma and Jake as weapons against their father. They'd subpoenaed my work records, looking for evidence that I was neglecting my cases due to emotional instability. They'd interviewed my neighbors, asking leading questions about whether they'd heard yelling from our house or noticed erratic behavior. Marcus himself had started showing up at Jake's baseball games with Vivian, playing the devoted father while I sat alone in the bleachers, knowing that every interaction was being scrutinized for signs of my supposed instability. But I had advantages that Marcus didn't realize I possessed. First, I was actually innocent of the charges he was leveling against me. Second, I was a better lawyer than anyone he could afford. And third, I had Jennifer Walsh, who'd agreed to testify about Marcus's pattern of behavior in previous relationships. More importantly, I'd started building my own case. Not just defending against his accusations, but gathering evidence of the systematic campaign he was waging against me. Every phone call to my office, every conversation with mutual friends designed to make me look bad, every manipulation of Emma and Jake during his custody visits, I documented it all. The breakthrough came when Emma, now 15 and increasingly disgusted with her father's behavior, told me about something that had happened during her last weekend at Marcus's apartment. "He was coaching me, Mom," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "He kept asking me to remember times when you were mean to him, or when you made him feel bad about himself. He wanted me to practice telling stories about how scared I was of you, how you yelled all the time, how you said terrible things about him." My blood ran cold. Marcus was actually trying to manipulate our teenage daughter into providing false testimony against me. It was one thing to attack me. I was an adult who could fight back. But involving Emma in his schemes crossed every line of decency I could imagine. "Did you tell him what he wanted to hear?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Emma looked at me with the kind of mature understanding that breaks your heart when you see it in your own child. "I told him I'd think about it. But Mom, I would never lie about you in court. Never. And neither would Jake." That night, I called Patricia Hendricks and told her what Emma had revealed. Patricia was quiet for a long moment, and then she said the words I'd been hoping to hear for months. "Sarah, I think we've got him. Coaching a minor to provide false testimony is serious misconduct. If we can prove he's doing it, it won't just destroy his custody case, it could result in criminal charges." The plan we developed was risky, but it was also brilliant in its simplicity. Emma would wear a wire during her next visit with Marcus, hidden in a device that looked like a regular fitness tracker. If he tried to coach her again, we'd have evidence that would end his campaign against me permanently. I hated involving Emma in something so deceptive, but she was adamant about participating. "He's trying to destroy our family, Mom," she said. "And he's using Jake and me to do it. I want to stop him." The wire worked perfectly. During Emma's Saturday visit with Marcus, he spent over an hour trying to get her to remember incidents that had never happened, coaching her on how to phrase her testimony to make me sound abusive and unstable. He even had Vivian participate, offering Emma shopping trips and spa days if she'd be willing to help Daddy by telling the court how much happier she was living with him. When Patricia and I listened to the recording, we both knew that Marcus had just handed us the victory we needed. But I wanted more than just to win the custody case. I wanted to make sure he could never hurt another family the way he'd hurt ours. That's when I remembered something Jennifer Walsh had mentioned during our first meeting. Marcus had a pattern of targeting women with assets, women who had something he could take. His first wife had been a teacher with a pension and a house. I was a lawyer with a successful practice and significant savings. What if Vivian wasn't just his mistress, but his next victim? I hired Dave Morrison again, this time to investigate Vivian's background and financial situation. What he found was both shocking and oddly predictable. Vivian Chen was a successful pharmaceutical sales rep who'd inherited a substantial trust fund from her grandmother. She owned 2 properties, had no debt, and was exactly the kind of financially stable woman that Marcus seemed drawn to. More interestingly, Dave discovered that Marcus had been lying to Vivian just as extensively as he'd lied to me. She thought he was divorced, thought his company had promoted him to regional director, and had no idea about the debt he'd accumulated or the second mortgage on our family home. Marcus had been playing his same manipulation game with her, just from a different angle. I made a decision that would have horrified me 6 months earlier but now felt like simple justice. I was going to tell Vivian the truth about the man she was planning to build a life with. The meeting took place at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory where neither of us would feel trapped. Vivian was even more beautiful in person than she'd been in Dave's photographs, but there was something fragile about her that the pictures hadn't captured. She sat across from me with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup like she was trying to warm herself, and I could see the confusion in her eyes as she tried to understand why her boyfriend's ex-wife had asked to meet with her. "I know this is strange," I began, "but there are things about Marcus that you need to know. Things that affect your safety and your financial security." I expected her to be defensive, to accuse me of being a bitter ex-wife trying to sabotage her relationship. Instead, Vivian listened with growing horror as I laid out the evidence of Marcus's lies, the job he'd lost, the debt he'd hidden, the second mortgage he'd taken out without my knowledge, and most damaging of all, the recording of him trying to coach Emma to provide false testimony. "He told me you were crazy," Vivian said quietly when I'd finished. "He said you'd been emotionally abusing him for years, that you were trying to turn the kids against him, that you'd probably try to contact me with lies about our relationship." "And what do you think now?" I asked. Vivian was quiet for a long time, staring into her coffee cup like she was reading tea leaves. Finally, she looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "I think I've been an idiot," she said. "And I think Marcus is about to learn that two can play his game." What happened next was more satisfying than anything I could have planned myself. Vivian didn't just break up with Marcus. She systematically dismantled the life he'd built with her money and credit. She cancelled the credit cards he'd been using, broke the lease on their apartment, and filed a police report about the financial fraud he'd committed by using her resources under false pretenses. More importantly, she agreed to testify in our custody case about Marcus's lies and manipulations, providing crucial corroboration for the pattern of deception I'd been documenting. The custody hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday in late October, almost exactly 1 year after I'd first discovered Marcus's affair. I woke up that morning feeling something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not just hope that I'd win, but hope that this nightmare was finally going to end. Marcus arrived at the courthouse looking confident, probably expecting his usual charm and manipulation to carry the day. He had no idea that his entire strategy was about to collapse around him like a house of cards in a windstorm. Patricia had warned me that family court could be unpredictable, that judges sometimes made decisions that defied logic or evidence. But as we presented our case, the financial fraud, the systematic lying, the coaching of our daughter to provide false testimony, and Vivian's testimony about his pattern of manipulation, I could see the judge's expression growing increasingly stern. When Marcus's lawyer tried to paint me as an unfit mother, Patricia played the recording of Marcus coaching Emma. The courtroom was dead silent as my 15-year-old daughter's voice filled the space, Marcus's voice clearly audible as he tried to manipulate her into lying about me. Marcus's face went white as he realized what was happening. This wasn't just losing a custody case. This was the complete destruction of his credibility and his future. The judge was looking at him like he was something distasteful that had been scraped off the bottom of a shoe. But I wasn't done yet. The custody case was just the opening move in a much larger game. Marcus had tried to destroy my life and my children's future for his own selfish purposes. Now it was time for him to learn what real consequences looked like. 2 weeks after the custody hearing, which had resulted in Marcus losing all unsupervised visitation rights and being ordered to pay significant child support, I got the call that would set the final act of this drama into motion. My law firm had been asked to handle a complex merger case for a pharmaceutical company based in Denver. It was the kind of high-profile, lucrative assignment that could make my career, involving 3 weeks of intensive work and negotiations that would require my complete attention. Under normal circumstances, I would have been thrilled for the opportunity. But these weren't normal circumstances. Emma and Jake were still recovering from the emotional trauma of their father's lies and the custody battle. Emma was seeing a therapist twice a week to process her anger and sense of betrayal. Jake was having nightmares again and had started having anxiety attacks at school. The last thing they needed was for their mother to disappear for 3 weeks on a business trip. Patricia convinced me to take the assignment. "Sarah, this is exactly what you need right now," she argued during one of our regular strategy sessions. "You need to rebuild your financial stability, and you need to show Emma and Jake that life goes on after trauma. They need to see their mother succeeding, not just surviving." She was right, but I still felt guilty about leaving them. We'd been through so much together over the past year, and they'd become my closest allies in ways that felt both wonderful and concerning. Emma, especially, had taken on too much responsibility for someone her age, worrying about me and Jake in ways that reminded me uncomfortably of myself at that age. I made arrangements for Emma and Jake to stay with my sister Carol and her family while I was gone. Carol lived about 20 minutes away in a house with a pool and a teenage son who got along well with both my kids. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best solution available. The night before I left for Denver, I sat both kids down for a serious conversation about what to expect while I was gone. "I know this timing isn't great," I told them, "but this case is really important for our future financial security. The money I earn from this will help us stay in the house and make sure Emma has what she needs for college applications." "Mom, we understand," Emma said, though I could see the worry in her eyes. "We'll be fine at Aunt Carol's. Jake loves playing with Michael, and I can help with homework and stuff." Jake, now 12 and more perceptive than I sometimes gave him credit for, looked at me with serious eyes. "Dad's not going to try anything while you're gone, is he?" The question broke my heart, because it meant Jake was still living in fear of his father's manipulation and lies. "No, sweetheart," I assured him. "The court order is very clear about Dad's visitation schedule, and Aunt Carol knows not to let him take you anywhere without my permission." But I had my own concerns about leaving town for 3 weeks. Marcus had been quiet since the custody hearing, too quiet. Men like him didn't just accept defeat and move on. They regrouped, they planned, they found new ways to assert control and inflict damage. The fact that I hadn't heard from him in 2 weeks felt more ominous than reassuring. I flew to Denver on a Sunday morning in early November, promising to call Emma and Jake every night and to come home immediately if they needed me for any reason. The work was exactly as intense as advertised. 12-hour days of contract review, negotiations that stretched late into the night, and the kind of high-stakes legal maneuvering that normally gave me an adrenaline rush. But I was distracted. Every phone call with Emma and Jake felt too short, and I found myself reading between the lines of their conversations, looking for signs that something was wrong. Emma was always upbeat and reassuring, maybe too much so. Jake was quieter than usual, and when I asked him direct questions about his day, his answers felt rehearsed. By the end of the first week, I was seriously considering flying home early. The merger negotiations were going well, better than expected, actually, but my maternal instincts were screaming that something was wrong with my children. I called Carol several times, but she insisted everything was fine, that the kids were adjusting well to the temporary arrangement. It was during the second week that I got the call that changed everything. I was in a conference room reviewing contracts when my phone buzzed with a call from Emma. She was supposed to be in school, and she never called during class unless there was an emergency. "Mom," she said, and her voice was strange, careful and controlled in a way that immediately put me on high alert. "I need to tell you something, but I can't talk long." "What's wrong?" I asked, stepping out of the conference room into the hallway. "Dad came to Aunt Carol's house yesterday," Emma said quietly. He said there was a change in the custody order, that you'd agreed to let him take Jake and me for an extended visit while you were out of town. My blood ran cold. There had been no change to the custody order. Marcus was only allowed supervised visits, and those had to be arranged through the court system with advance notice. Whatever he was planning, it wasn't legal. Emma, did Aunt Carol let him take you? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She didn't want to, but Dad had official-looking papers and he was really insistent. He said you'd be angry if she didn't follow the court order. And Mom. Emma's voice dropped to almost a whisper. He brought Vivian with him. Except he didn't call her Vivian. He called her his wife. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Marcus and Vivian weren't married. I would have been notified if he'd filed for remarriage, since it could affect child support calculations. But Emma was smart and observant, and she wouldn't have misheard something that important. Where are you now? I asked. We're at Dad's apartment, but it's different. All our stuff is here, our clothes, our books, Jake's baseball equipment. It's like he moved our entire rooms here while you were gone. I felt sick. Marcus had used my business trip as an opportunity to essentially kidnap my children, creating a fake custody arrangement and physically moving their belongings to make it look like a legitimate transfer. It was exactly the kind of calculated manipulation I should have expected from him, but the audacity of it still shocked me. Emma, I need you to listen to me very carefully, I said. You and Jake are going to pack a small bag with just the essentials you need for a day or two. Don't let Dad or Vivian see you doing it. Can you do that? Yes, she said, and I could hear the fear in her voice now that she was letting her careful control slip. I'm flying home tonight, I told her. I'll be there tomorrow morning, and we're going to fix this. But Emma, if Dad tries to take you anywhere else, if he talks about moving or changing schools or anything like that, you call 911 immediately. What is done is kidnapping, and it's illegal. The flight home from Denver was the longest 6 hours of my life. I called Patricia from the airport, and she immediately filed an emergency motion for Marcus's arrest and the return of my children. I called the police and reported the violation of the custody order. I even called Jennifer Walsh, because I needed to talk to someone who understood exactly what Marcus was capable of. He's escalating, Jennifer said when I reached her. This is what he did to me right before he completely disappeared with my daughter. Sarah, you need to be prepared for the possibility that he's planning to run. I landed at Columbus Airport at 7 in the morning and drove straight to Marcus's apartment complex. My hands were shaking as I climbed the stairs to his unit, and what I saw when I reached his door made me realize that this situation was even worse than I'd feared. The apartment was empty. Not just of Marcus and Vivian and my children, but of everything. Furniture, personal belongings, even the cheap artwork that had been hanging on the walls during my previous visits, it was all gone. Marcus had used my 3-week business trip to orchestrate the complete disappearance of my children. And standing there in that empty apartment, I realized that this was what he'd been planning all along. The custody battle, the financial manipulation, the systematic destruction of my reputation, it had all been preparation for this moment when he would steal Emma and Jake and vanish completely. But Marcus had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated how far a mother would go to protect her children, and he definitely underestimated my capacity for strategic thinking when everything I loved was at stake. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. The first thing I did after finding Marcus's empty apartment was call 911. The dispatcher was professional but skeptical until I explained that I was a family law attorney and that my ex-husband had violated a court order by taking my children without permission. Within 20 minutes, I was sitting in a police station giving a statement to Detective Rodriguez, a tired-looking woman in her 40s who specialized in family abduction cases. Mrs. Mitchell, Detective Rodriguez said, reviewing the custody paperwork Patricia had rushed over, I have to be honest with you. These cases are complicated because technically, he's their biological father. Unless we can prove he's taken them out of state or that there's immediate danger to the children, our hands are somewhat tied. He forged custody documents to obtain my children from my sister, I said, trying to keep my voice level. He physically moved their belongings without my knowledge or consent. He's violated a court order that specifically limits his access to supervised visits only. How is that not kidnapping? Detective Rodriguez nodded sympathetically. It is kidnapping, legally speaking. But family abduction cases move slowly through the system, and in the meantime, your ex-husband has a significant head start. Do you have any idea where he might have taken them? I thought about what Emma had told me during our last phone call. The apartment had been set up like Marcus had moved the kids' rooms there permanently. Vivian had been introduced as his wife, not his girlfriend. Everything about the situation suggested long-term planning, not a spontaneous decision to flee with the children. Detective, I said slowly, what if he hasn't left town? What if he's hiding somewhere locally while making it look like he's disappeared? Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. What makes you think that? I explained about Marcus's pattern of elaborate deception, his need to control narratives and manipulate situations to his advantage. Running away with Emma and Jake would be difficult and expensive, requiring new identities and constant vigilance. But hiding in plain sight while letting everyone assume he'd fled? That was exactly the kind of psychological manipulation Marcus excelled at. If he's still local, Rodriguez said, he'd need somewhere to keep 3 people hidden for an extended period. Somewhere off the radar but comfortable enough for children. Any ideas? That's when I remembered something that had seemed insignificant at the time but now felt crucial. During one of our last arguments before Marcus moved out, he'd mentioned that his mother was thinking about selling her house and moving to a retirement community. Grace Mitchell lived about an hour outside Columbus in a rural area where neighbors minded their own business and unexpected visitors wouldn't attract attention. I shared this theory with Detective Rodriguez, who immediately dispatched officers to Grace's address. But I had a sinking feeling that Marcus was too smart to hide in the most obvious location. If he was still in Ohio, he'd be somewhere I wouldn't think to look. While waiting for news from the police, I drove home to survey the damage Marcus had done to our house. Patricia had warned me that he'd apparently had access to the property while I was in Denver, but I wasn't prepared for what I found when I walked through my front door. The house looked like it had been systematically looted. Not burglarized, looted with surgical precision. Marcus had taken Emma's computer, her jewelry box, all the photo albums from her childhood. From Jake's room, he'd taken his gaming console, his baseball card collection, and the signed baseball from his favorite player that we'd bought for his 10th birthday. But it was when I went down to the basement that I discovered the full scope of what Marcus had done. Our basement had been partially finished, set up as a family room with a couch, television, and storage area for seasonal decorations and childhood keepsakes. But now it looked like a completely different space. Marcus had moved Emma and Jake's bedroom furniture down there, their beds, dressers, desk, even their childhood stuffed animals and posters. He'd created a living space that was functional but clearly intended as a downgrade from their real bedrooms upstairs. It was then that I understood what Marcus's plan had really been. This wasn't about hiding the children or fleeing the state. This was about psychological manipulation on a scale I hadn't imagined possible. Marcus had spent the 3 weeks of my business trip convincing Emma and Jake that they were being moved to the basement because his new wife deserved the best rooms in the house. He'd systematically downgraded their living situation while I was away, making them feel like unwanted guests in their own home, and then presented himself as their rescuer by taking them to live with him. I stood in that basement, surrounded by my children's belongings arranged like a shabby apartment, and felt rage unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Marcus hadn't just violated the custody order, he psychologically abused Emma and Jake, making them feel worthless and unwanted in the most cruel and calculated way possible. But there was something else in the basement that I almost missed in my fury. Tucked behind Jake's dresser was a small notebook in Emma's handwriting. I pulled it out and flipped through pages of what looked like a diary, except the entries weren't about typical teenage concerns. They were documentation of everything Marcus had said and done during the 3 weeks I was away. Day 3. Dad came again today with Vivian. He said Mom agreed that we should live in the basement since his wife needs the upstairs bedrooms for her daughter. Jake cried and asked why Mom would agree to that. I told him Mom would never agree to that, but Dad showed us papers that looked official. Day 8. Dad moved all our stuff to the basement today. He said it was temporary until Mom got back, but Vivian kept talking about redecorating the upstairs bedrooms. I asked if I could call Mom, but Dad said she was too busy with work to be bothered. Day 12. Jake asked Dad when Mom was coming home. Dad said maybe Mom didn't want to come home, that maybe she liked her work more than she liked us. I know that's not true, but Jake started crying anyway. Day 15. Dad said we might be happier living with him permanently. He said Mom was probably going to be too busy for us anyway when she got back. Vivian bought us new clothes and said we could call her whatever we wanted, that she wanted to be like a mother to us. I read through Emma's entire documentation of those 3 weeks, and what emerged was a picture of systematic psychological abuse designed to make my children feel abandoned and unloved. Marcus had used every tool of manipulation he possessed to convince Emma and Jake that I had chosen work over them, that their own mother viewed them as burdens to be hidden in the basement. The cruelest part was how he twisted my success into evidence of my failure as a mother. The business trip that I'd taken to secure our financial future had been reframed as abandonment. The work that I'd been doing to rebuild our lives after his betrayal had been used against me as proof that I didn't care about my children. But Emma had been too smart to believe his lies completely. Her notebook was filled with observations about inconsistencies in Marcus's stories, questions about why I would have agreed to things that seemed completely out of character, and growing certainty that their father was lying to them about my intentions and my love for them. On the last page, she'd written something that made me cry for the first time since this nightmare began. Day 18. I don't believe anything Dad says anymore. Mom would never put us in the basement. Mom would never choose work over us. Mom would never abandon us. Something is wrong, and I think Dad is lying about everything. I hope Mom comes home soon so we can figure out what's really happening. Emma had been protecting Jake and documenting evidence while I was across the country completely unaware of what was happening. My 15-year-old daughter had been more prepared for Marcus's manipulation than I had been, and she'd been building a case against him while living under his psychological abuse. My phone rang while I was still sitting in the basement surrounded by the evidence of Marcus's cruelty. It was Detective Rodriguez. Mrs. Mitchell, we found them. They're at a rental house about 30 miles north of Columbus. Your ex-husband was using a false name, but your daughter apparently slipped a note to a grocery store clerk asking them to call the police. Emma. My brilliant, brave, resourceful daughter had managed to get help despite being under Marcus's control. Are they safe? I asked. They're fine physically, Rodriguez said. But Mrs. Mitchell, when we arrested your ex-husband, he was in the process of dyeing your son's hair and had already changed your daughter's appearance significantly. We think he was preparing to move them again, possibly out of state. I drove to the police station faster than I'd ever driven anywhere in my life. Emma and Jake were waiting in a victim services room, and when I walked through that door and saw them safe and whole, I collapsed onto my knees and pulled them both into my arms. I'm so sorry, I whispered into their hair. I'm so sorry I wasn't there to protect you. Mom, Emma said, pulling back to look at me with eyes that were older than they'd been 3 weeks earlier. It wasn't your fault. Dad planned this whole thing. He wanted us to think you didn't love us anymore, but I knew better. I knew you'd come for us. Jake, who'd been quiet during the reunion, finally spoke. Mom, why did Dad say you put us in the basement? Why did he say you didn't want us anymore? I looked at my son, this sweet boy who'd been psychologically tortured by his own father, and I made a decision that I should have made months earlier. Because your father is sick, Jake. He's sick in a way that makes him hurt people, especially people who love him. And he's never going to be part of our lives again. As I held my children in that police station, I realized that Marcus had finally made the mistake that would end this war permanently. He'd committed crimes that couldn't be explained away or justified by clever legal maneuvering. He'd shown the world exactly what kind of man he really was, and there would be consequences this time that he couldn't manipulate his way out of. But most importantly, he'd revealed his true nature to Emma and Jake in a way that would immunize them against his manipulation forever. They'd seen behind his mask, experienced his cruelty firsthand, and they would never again be vulnerable to his lies and false promises. The war was almost over, and Marcus had lost far more than he'd ever imagined possible. The trial of Marcus Mitchell for child abduction, violation of a court order, and psychological abuse made headlines in Columbus for 3 weeks. It wasn't every day that a respected businessman was caught in such an elaborate scheme to steal his own children, and the local media covered every detail with the kind of fascination usually reserved for celebrity scandals. I testified for 2 days about the systematic deception Marcus had employed, the financial fraud he'd committed, and the psychological manipulation he'd used against Emma and Jake. Patricia presented a timeline of his behavior that stretched back over 2 years, showing how everything from the affair to the custody battle to the final abduction had been part of a calculated plan to maintain control over his family while appearing to be the victim of circumstances. But the most damaging testimony came from Emma herself. At 16, she was old enough to testify on her own behalf, and she'd insisted on doing so despite the emotional difficulty of facing her father in court. Emma took the witness stand wearing a simple blue dress that made her look younger than her years, but when she began speaking, her voice carried the authority of someone who'd survived something terrible and emerged stronger. "My father told us that Mom had put us in the basement because his new wife deserved the better rooms," Emma said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "He said Mom had chosen her work over us, that she probably wouldn't even notice we were gone. He made Jake cry every day by telling him that Mom didn't love us anymore." Marcus's lawyer tried to object, claiming that Emma was too young to understand the complexity of adult relationships and custody arrangements. But Judge Harrison, a stern woman in her 60s who'd been handling family court cases for 20 years, wasn't having it. "The defendant chose to involve this child in his manipulation scheme," Judge Harrison said coldly. "She has every right to tell this court what she experienced." Emma continued her testimony, describing the 3 weeks of psychological torture Marcus had put them through. She talked about how he'd shown them fake court documents claiming that I'd agreed to surrender custody. She described how he'd convinced them that their mother had abandoned them, that they were unwanted burdens who deserved to live in a basement while his real family occupied the good parts of the house. "But I knew my mom would never do that," Emma concluded, looking directly at Marcus for the first time since taking the stand. "I knew she loved us too much to hurt us like that. So I started writing down everything Dad said, because I knew it wasn't true, and I knew someone would need to know what really happened." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Marcus was sentenced to 18 months in prison for child abduction, with additional time for violating court orders and committing fraud in the fake custody documents he'd created. But the criminal case was only the beginning of his consequences. The Ohio Bar Association opened an investigation into my ex-husband's conduct, even though he wasn't an attorney. His actions had involved fraud, perjury, and the systematic abuse of legal processes, all of which reflected poorly on the legal profession in general. While they couldn't disbar him, they issued a formal censure that would make it extremely difficult for him to work in any law-adjacent field. More significantly, Vivian filed both criminal and civil charges against Marcus for the financial fraud he'd committed against her. It turned out that during their relationship, he'd used her credit cards, forged her signature on loan documents, and stolen nearly $40,000 from her personal accounts to finance his elaborate schemes. Vivian had been another victim of his manipulation, not a willing accomplice, and she was determined to see him held accountable for every penny he'd stolen. The civil judgment alone would keep Marcus in debt for the rest of his life. But perhaps the most satisfying consequence was what happened to his reputation in our community. Columbus might be a big city, but the legal and business communities are relatively small, and word travels fast about someone who would psychologically torture his own children for the sake of maintaining control. Marcus's former colleagues distanced themselves from him completely. The country club where he'd been a member for 10 years revoked his membership. Even his own mother, Grace, publicly condemned his actions and offered to testify on my behalf in any future proceedings. "I raised a son," Grace told me when she called to apologize for Marcus's behavior. "I don't know what happened to turn him into the monster who would hurt those beautiful children, but is not welcome in my home or my life anymore." The psychological evaluation that was ordered as part of Marcus's sentencing painted a picture of a man with narcissistic personality disorder and sociopathic tendencies. Dr. Elizabeth Chang, the court-appointed psychiatrist, concluded that Marcus was incapable of genuine empathy and viewed other people, including his own children, as objects to be manipulated for his own benefit. "The defendant shows no remorse for his actions," Dr. Chang wrote in her report. He continues to believe that his behavior was justified and that he was the victim of unfair persecution. This lack of insight, combined with his demonstrated willingness to harm children for personal gain, makes him an ongoing danger to his family and society. The report recommended that Marcus's parental rights be permanently terminated and that he be prohibited from any unsupervised contact with minors. Judge Harrison agreed, and with the stroke of her pen, Marcus ceased to be Emma and Jake's father in any legal sense. Emma and Jake handled the aftermath of the trial better than I'd expected. Emma threw herself into her junior year of high school with renewed focus, determined to prove that her father's abuse hadn't broken her. She joined the debate team, started volunteering at a local women's shelter, and began talking about wanting to study psychology in college so she could help other children who'd been manipulated by abusive parents. Jake, now 13, was quieter about his recovery but equally determined to move forward. He returned to baseball with a vengeance, making the varsity team as an 8th grader and earning a scholarship to attend a prestigious summer baseball camp. More importantly, he stopped having nightmares and began sleeping through the night again. Both kids started seeing Dr. Rachel Morrison, a family therapist who specialized in helping children recover from psychological abuse. Dr. Morrison helped them understand that their father's behavior had nothing to do with their worth as people, that adults who hurt children are responsible for their own choices, and that they deserve to feel safe and loved in their own home. "Your children are remarkably resilient," Dr. Morrison told me during one of our family sessions. "They've been through something traumatic, but they had a foundation of love and security that protected them from the worst psychological damage. They know they're loved, Sarah, and that knowledge is what saved them." 6 months after Marcus's sentencing, I received a letter from him in prison. It was 3 pages of self-pity and blame, claiming that I'd destroyed his life by being vindictive and unforgiving. He accused me of turning his children against him, of ruining his relationship with Vivian, of being responsible for his financial ruin and criminal conviction. Not once in those 3 pages did he acknowledge the pain he'd caused Emma and Jake. Not once did he take responsibility for the psychological torture he'd inflicted on his own children. Even in prison, facing the consequences of his choices, Marcus remained convinced that he was the victim of everyone else's unreasonable expectations. I read the letter once, showed it to Patricia for legal documentation purposes, and then threw it in the trash. Marcus no longer had the power to hurt us, and I wasn't going to give him space in my mind or my heart anymore. The house felt different after Marcus's sentencing. Not just because he was gone, he'd been physically absent for months, but because the threat he represented was finally neutralized. Emma and Jake could come home from school without worrying that their father might be there with more lies and manipulation. I could travel for work without fear that my children would disappear while I was gone. We started the long process of healing as a family. I moved Emma and Jake's rooms back upstairs where they belonged, and we turned the basement back into a family recreation space. We painted Emma's room her favorite shade of purple and redecorated Jake's with a baseball theme that reflected his renewed passion for the sport. More importantly, we started talking about what had happened in ways that helped us all process the trauma. Emma wrote an essay about her experience for her English class that was so powerful her teacher recommended it for publication in the school literary magazine. Jake started seeing a counselor who helped him work through his anger and confusion about having a father who tried to hurt him. As for me, I threw myself into rebuilding the successful legal career that Marcus had tried to destroy. The Denver merger case had been a huge success, leading to more high-profile assignments and a partnership offer from one of Columbus's most prestigious law firms. I was making more money than I'd ever dreamed of, and for the first time in years, I felt proud of what I'd accomplished. But the real victory wasn't financial or professional. The real victory was watching Emma and Jake flourish without the toxic influence of their father's manipulation. Emma was accepted early admission to Northwestern University with a full scholarship. Jake made the high school varsity baseball team as a freshman and was already being scouted by college recruiters. They were happy, healthy, successful kids who'd survived something terrible and emerged stronger because of it. They knew their own worth, understood healthy relationships, and would never again be vulnerable to the kind of psychological manipulation their father had attempted. On the first anniversary of Marcus's sentencing, I took Emma and Jake out to dinner at Romano's, the same restaurant where Marcus had taken Vivian during his affair. It felt like the perfect place to celebrate how far we'd come. "Mom," Emma said over dessert, Do you ever regret fighting Dad as hard as you did? Like, would it have been easier to just let him take us and disappear? I looked at my daughter, brilliant, strong, compassionate Emma, who documented evidence against her own father to protect her little brother, and felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with her grades or achievements. Emma, I said, the only thing I regret is that it took me so long to see who your father really was. Fighting for you and Jake wasn't a choice. It was the only option that let me sleep at night and look at myself in the mirror. Jake nodded seriously. I'm glad you fought for us, Mom. I'm glad Dad can't hurt us anymore. We sat in that restaurant where Marcus had once planned our destruction, and we toasted to our survival, our strength, and our future. The war was over, and we had won more than I'd ever dared to hope for. Marcus remained in prison, forgotten by everyone who'd once respected him, facing years of debt and legal consequences for his choices. His name had become synonymous with betrayal and child abuse in our community. He'd lost his children, his reputation, his freedom, and any chance of rebuilding a life based on lies and manipulation. But we were free. Free from his control, free from his lies, and free to build whatever future we wanted without fear that he would try to destroy it. Sometimes the good guys really do win. Sometimes justice isn't just served, it's served ice cold, with a side of permanent consequences and a garnish of public humiliation. And sometimes, a mother's love really is stronger than a narcissist's need for control. 3 years have passed since Marcus was sentenced, and I'm sitting in my new office on the 20th floor of downtown Columbus's most prestigious law firm, looking out at the city where my children and I rebuilt our lives from the ashes of his betrayal. The nameplate on my door reads Sarah Mitchell, partner, and I still get a little thrill every time I see it. Emma is thriving at Northwestern, double majoring in psychology and pre-law with plans to specialize in family trauma and child advocacy. She calls me every Sunday to talk about her classes, her internship at a domestic violence shelter, and the boy she's dating who treats her with the respect and kindness she learned to expect from watching me fight for what we deserved. Mom, she told me during our last call, I want to do what you do. I want to help families escape situations like ours. I want to make sure other kids don't have to go through what Jake and I went through. Jake, now 16, is being recruited by Division I colleges for baseball. He's grown 4 inches in the past year, and the shy, anxious boy who used to have nightmares about his father has become a confident young man who stands up for his teammates and volunteers at youth baseball clinics in his free time. But the transformation I'm proudest of is my own. I'm not the same woman who discovered that photograph of her husband with another woman 3 years ago. That Sarah was naive enough to believe that good intentions and honest communication could solve any problem. She thought that loving someone completely was enough to keep them from betraying you. She believed that playing by the rules would protect her family from people who had no intention of playing by the rules. This Sarah knows better. I've learned that some people are simply incapable of empathy, that they view relationships as games to be won rather than partnerships to be nurtured. I've learned that loving someone doesn't mean accepting abuse, and that protecting your children sometimes means being willing to destroy their other parent's life completely. Most importantly, I've learned that revenge isn't always about getting even. Sometimes it's about making sure the person who hurt you can never hurt anyone else the same way. The law practice I've built specializes in cases like mine. Women who've discovered that their entire marriages were built on lies, that their husbands have been systematically stealing from them, manipulating their children, and preparing to disappear with everything that matters. I use every tool at my disposal to ensure that these men face real consequences for their choices, not just slaps on the wrist that allow them to move on to their next victims. Jennifer Walsh works as a consultant for my firm now, helping other women recognize the signs of systematic manipulation and financial abuse. She never got her daughter back. Marcus's first victim was so thoroughly brainwashed that she chose to stay with her father even after the truth about his behavior came to light. But Jennifer has helped dozens of other women avoid the same fate, and that's given her the purpose and healing she needed to rebuild her own life. The work we do matters, Sarah, Jennifer told me recently. Every woman we help, every child we save from psychological abuse, every manipulator we expose, it creates ripple effects that protect families we'll never even meet. She's right. The cases I've won have created legal precedents that make it harder for abusive men to manipulate the family court system. The media attention our victories have generated has educated other women about the warning signs of psychological abuse and financial fraud. The network of professionals we've built, therapists, private investigators, financial forensics experts, has become a resource that helps women escape situations that once felt hopeless. But I've also learned that healing isn't linear, and victory doesn't erase trauma. There are still nights when I wake up in a cold sweat, dreaming that Marcus has somehow escaped prison and is coming for Emma and Jake. There are still moments when I question every decision I made during our marriage, wondering if I could have seen the signs earlier, protected my children better, avoided the whole nightmare if I'd been smarter or more aware. The therapy I've been doing with Dr. Morrison has helped me understand that this self-doubt is normal for trauma survivors, but it doesn't make it easier to live with. Some wounds leave scars that ache when the weather changes, and some betrayals leave you fundamentally changed in ways that can't be undone. I'm more careful now about who I trust. I'm hypervigilant about my children's emotional states and maybe too quick to assume the worst when they seem upset or distant. I've become the kind of person who runs background checks on people I date and who has emergency plans for situations that will probably never happen. But I've also become stronger, more confident, and more determined to use my experiences to help other women avoid what we went through. Last month, I got a letter from a woman in Portland whose husband had been systematically draining their savings to finance an affair while telling her that their marriage was in trouble because of her depression. She'd read about our case online and wanted advice about how to protect herself and her children. I spent 2 hours on the phone with her, walking through the steps she needed to take to document his behavior, secure her finances, and build a case that would protect her children from manipulation. By the end of our conversation, she had a plan, a referral to an excellent attorney in her area, and the confidence to know that she wasn't crazy or overreacting. "You saved my life," she told me through tears. I was starting to believe that maybe I was the problem, that maybe I deserved what was happening to me. That phone call reminded me why I do this work, why I've built my career around helping women escape situations that once seemed hopeless. Marcus destroyed my marriage, traumatized my children, and nearly bankrupted our family. But he also inadvertently created something powerful, a woman who understood exactly how dangerous men like him could be, and who was willing to use everything she'd learned to make sure they faced real consequences for their choices. The final chapter of Marcus's story came 6 months ago, when he was released from prison after serving his full sentence. He'd learned nothing from his time incarcerated, and within weeks of his release, he was arrested again for identity theft and fraud. Apparently, he'd been using fake names to obtain credit cards and had attempted to contact Emma through social media using a false identity. This time, he was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, and when he's released, he'll be a registered sex offender due to the psychological abuse charges involving minors. His name appears on databases that will prevent him from working with children, living in most residential areas, and rebuilding the kind of respectable facade he'd used to manipulate his previous victims. Marcus Mitchell is now exactly what he always was underneath his charming exterior, a recognized predator whose name is synonymous with child abuse and betrayal. The difference is that now everyone can see it. Emma and Jake rarely mention their biological father anymore. When they do, it's with the kind of clinical detachment you'd use to discuss someone you'd read about in a news article, a person who exists but has no relevance to your actual life. They call themselves Mitchell children, not because they're proud of their father's name, but because they're proud of the mother who fought to save them. They understand that family isn't about blood relations, it's about the people who show up, who tell you the truth, who protect you even when it costs them everything. As I write this, I can see Jake's baseball game through my office window. His pitching today, and even from 20 floors up, I can tell he's confident and focused. Emma is home from college for spring break, probably studying at our kitchen table where she does her best work. Tonight, we'll have dinner together as a family, not because a court order requires it, not because someone is manipulating us into performing happiness, but because we genuinely enjoy each other's company and have built something real and lasting from the wreckage of what came before. If you're watching this video because you're in a situation similar to what my family went through, I want you to know something important. You're not crazy, you're not asking for too much, and you deserve better than what you're accepting. The person who's lying to you, manipulating you, or stealing from you is counting on your love, your loyalty, and your willingness to give them the benefit of the doubt. They're counting on your fear of disrupting your children's lives, your concern about financial security, Your hope that things will get better if you're just more patient or more understanding. But some people don't get better. Some people get worse when they realize they can get away with hurting you. And some situations don't improve with time and patience, they improve with boundaries, consequences, and the willingness to fight for what you and your children deserve. The war I fought for my family's future was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was also the most important. It taught Emma and Jake that they're worth fighting for, that their mother's love is stronger than their father's manipulation, and that good people really do win sometimes. More importantly, it taught me that I'm stronger than I ever imagined, that survival isn't just about enduring trauma, it's about transforming that trauma into wisdom, strength, and the power to protect other people from experiencing what you went through. Marcus thought he could destroy us. Instead, he made us unbreakable. And if you're facing your own version of Marcus, if someone in your life is trying to convince you that you're the problem, that you're asking for too much, that you should be grateful for whatever scraps of love and respect they're willing to give you, I want you to know that you have more power than you realize. You have the power to say no. You have the power to demand better. You have the power to fight for the life you and your children deserve, and to win that fight even when it seems impossible. The best revenge isn't getting even. It's building a life so beautiful, so successful, and so filled with genuine love and happiness that your abuser becomes irrelevant to your story except as the person who accidentally taught you how strong you really are. Thank you for listening to our story. Thank you for caring about families like mine who've survived something terrible and chosen to use that survival to help others. And if this video helped you in any way, if it gave you hope or courage or just the knowledge that you're not alone, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Together, we're stronger than the people who try to tear us down. Together, we win.